Victory is supposed to make empires richer. Less enemies, lower costs, more control. But what if every victory made survival more expensive? Imagine a state where the army is always paid, even in peace, where borders are protected not once, but continuously with money, where stopping payments is more dangerous than losing a battle. This empire didn't collapse when it ran out of soldiers. It collapsed when it ran out of room to keep paying. War didn't end. It stayed on the balance sheet. And once survival itself became a fixed expense, collapse stopped being a choice and turned into a financial certainty. In the mid-15th century, when Constantinople fell into their hands, it wasn't just a city changing rulers. It was an economic system being absorbed, a place where land routes met sea routes, where trade between continents had no choice but to pass through controlled gates. Suddenly, money didn't need to be chased. It arrived. From the Balkans to the Eastern Mediterranean, expansion followed the same logic. Territory wasn't valuable just because it was land. It was valuable because it produced revenue. Farms paid land taxes, ports collected customs duties, vassals sent tribute in exchange for protection. War funded itself through what it captured next. At the center of this system stood a strong, centralized authority. The Sultan didn't just command armies, he controlled appointments, revenue flows, and enforcement. Power moved upward, not outward. Officials rotated frequently, preventing local dynasties from forming. Money reached the center before resistance could. By the late 15th century, this empire wasn't just powerful, it was financially organized. Expansion reduced risk. New territory covered new costs. Victory made the system stronger. For a long time, the numbers worked. Growth absorbed expense. Control justified spending. Survival felt secure. But this entire structure rested on one silent assumption that war would always pay for itself, and that expansion would never slow. At first, war behaved the way war always had. It started. It ended. Costs rose during campaigns and dropped when fighting stopped. Expansion covered expenses, and peace meant recovery. Then something shifted. By the 16th century, conflict stopped arriving in clear chapters. Pressure came from multiple directions at once: Western rivals, Eastern rivals, internal revolts. Even when no major battle was happening, the possibility of one never disappeared. That changed how the state spent money. The army could no longer be raised and disbanded. It had to exist continuously. Soldiers needed regular salaries even in peace. Equipment had to be maintained. Garrisons had to be staffed year-round. The cost of war no longer depended on fighting. It depended on readiness. Expansion slowed, borders stabilized, but expenses didn't slow with them. The empire was no longer paying for conquest. It was paying for prevention. Every year without war still required war-level spending. Every season of peace came with the same military bill. The system had quietly crossed a line. War was no longer an event the empire entered and exited. It became infrastructure, something that had to be funded just to keep the state functioning. As long as revenue kept up, this shift felt manageable. The army existed. Order held. Control remained intact. But once war becomes permanent, its cost stops responding to success, and the next pressure point was waiting inside the army itself. At its peak, the empire's military advantage rested on a single institution. The janissaries were not just soldiers. They were salaried professionals, trained, disciplined, and directly loyal to the state. Early on, this was an advantage no rival could match. Because they were paid regularly, they didn't need land. Because they were centrally controlled, they didn't fragment power. Because they were permanent, the state could respond quickly to threats. But permanence has a price. By the late 16th century, recruitment rules loosened. The corps expanded. What had once been a compact elite became a massive standing force. Numbers increased faster than revenue. Salaries that were once exceptional became expected. Bonuses followed. Payments for campaigns. Payments for peace. Payments just to keep order in the capital. Then another cost appeared. Pensions. Soldiers who no longer fought still had to be paid. The army stopped shrinking when threats faded. It only grew. At the same time, the janissaries gained political leverage. Their salaries made them indispensable. Their presence in the capital made them dangerous to oppose. When reforms threatened pay or status, resistance turned violent. Mutinies weren't accidents. They were negotiations conducted with weapons. The state lost the ability to reduce military spending without risking internal collapse. Salaries became fixed costs. Downsizing was no longer an option. The army stopped protecting the state. The state started protecting the army. Every year, more revenue was locked into obligations that couldn't be canceled. Even in peace, even in stability, the treasury had to feed a system that no longer adjusted to reality. And once military spending becomes untouchable, the only flexibility left lies outside the army, in how war itself is managed. By the 17th century, the empire wasn't trying to eliminate conflict. It was trying to contain it cheaply. Direct conquest was slow, expensive, and politically risky, so pressure was absorbed at the edges instead of crushed at the center. Frontiers became buffers, Local rulers were maintained, not removed. Money moved outward to keep problems from moving inward. Instead of redrawing borders through war, the state stabilized them through cash. This wasn't weakness, it was accounting. Full campaigns demanded massive mobilization, long supply chains, and months of disruption. Payments were predictable. They could be planned. They fit into budgets. As long as the Treasury could handle them, they reduced uncertainty. But predictability came with dependency. Once provincial leaders and border powers adjusted to receiving regular payments, those payments became part of their expectations. Stability now depended on continuity, not strength. Alongside this, the empire leaned harder on auxiliary forces. Irregular troops and contracted fighters were easier to deploy and politically safer than expanding the core army. But they operated on cash. Their loyalty lasted exactly as long as funding did. Conflict didn't disappear. It fragmented. Small tensions replaced decisive wars, but none of them closed permanently. Each unresolved front stayed active in the budget. The state wasn't paying to win. It was paying to keep things from getting worse. And once war is managed through maintenance instead of resolution, stopping payments doesn't restore peace. It exposes everything that was being held in place by money. That logic pushed the empire toward a deeper problem: how to extract more revenue without breaking the economy that produced it. By this stage, the problem was no longer collection. It was arithmetic. Military salaries were fixed. Payments to troops, bonuses, pensions. A lame obligation. But agricultural output had fallen. Tax revenue weakened. The numbers no longer matched. So the state didn't cut spending. It adjusted the money. The silver content of the akçe was quietly reduced. The coin looked the same. The denomination stayed the same. But each piece contained less real value. More coins could now be minted to meet the same obligations. On paper, nothing broke. In reality, everything shifted. Soldiers noticed first. Their wages bought less food. Bonuses felt smaller. Pay delays triggered unrest. The same army that had become a fixed cost now became a source of instability. Merchants followed. Prices adjusted upward. Goods cost more, not because they were rarer, but because the money buying them was weaker. Foreign traders demanded better terms, or refused the currency altogether. Trust eroded transaction by transaction. The state responded the only way it could, by minting more debased coins to cover rising prices, which pushed prices even higher. This wasn't a collapse caused by lack of metal. Silver still existed. What disappeared was credibility. Money stopped functioning as a stable measure. It became something to spend quickly before it lost more value. Savings evaporated. Long-term planning became impossible. The Ottomans didn't run out of money. They ran out of trust in their money. And once a currency loses trust, every cost rises at the same time, including the cost of war, administration, and survival itself. By the 17th century, the empire wasn't facing separate problems anymore. It was trapped inside a loop where each fix made the next failure inevitable. War demanded spending. Spending demanded higher taxes. Higher taxes pushed farmers off the land. Production fell. With less production, revenue shrank. To fill the gap, the state debased the currency. Debasement triggered inflation. Inflation raised military costs. Higher military costs demanded more revenue. And to secure that revenue, pressure increased again. On land, on trade, on money. Nothing here was irrational. Each step made sense in isolation. When borders were unstable, spending more felt necessary. When revenue fell, squeezing harder felt logical. When money lost value, minting more felt unavoidable. But together, these choices fed each other. Instability justified war. War justified spending. Spending justified extraction. Extraction destroyed productivity. Falling productivity destabilized everything again. There was no pause button. Breaking the loop at any point carried immediate risk. Cutting military pay invited mutiny. Reducing taxes threatened supply shortages. Stabilizing the currency required metal the treasury no longer had. So the system kept moving forward, not because it worked, but because stopping felt more dangerous than continuing. The empire wasn't collapsing outward. It was tightening inward. And with every turn of this loop, survival became more expensive, more fragile, and more dependent on short-term fixes that guaranteed long-term decline. From the outside, the empire still looked intact. There was still a sultan. Decrees were still issued. Courts still functioned. The bureaucracy continued to record, regulate, and respond. On paper, the state survived. But inside, everything operated in reaction mode. The treasury no longer planned years ahead. It moved from shortage to shortage. Revenue arrived already assigned, to salaries, to stipends, to debt-like obligations created by past decisions. There was no surplus left to absorb shock. The army still existed, but its effectiveness depended on payments arriving on time. Administration still worked, but only as long as money kept circulating. Authority remained, but it was enforced through maintenance rather than momentum. Every reform proposal ran into the same wall. Change required stability. Stability required money. Money required the system to remain exactly as it was, so the empire held itself together by continuity alone. Not strength, not growth, just routine. It still wore the armor of a great power, ranks, titles, institutions, but the body underneath was exhausted. Every movement cost more than the last. Every delay drained what little energy remained. And as long as the structure stayed upright, the real damage stayed hidden, until maintaining control itself became the heaviest burden the state had to carry. The Ottoman Empire didn't collapse because it was reckless or incompetent. Almost every choice it made was rational under pressure. Paying soldiers prevented mutiny. Renting stability avoided costly wars. Securing revenue up front kept the state functioning. Each decision bought time. But time became the most expensive resource of all. Every delay locked the empire into higher fixed costs. Every workaround turned into a permanent obligation. The system survived year after year, but it did so by selling pieces of its future to protect the present. Control was never lost suddenly. It became unaffordable gradually. The empire didn't fall because it failed to adapt. It fell because adaptation itself carried a price that kept rising. In the end, collapse wasn't caused by a single defeat or reform gone wrong. It was the result of a long series of smart financial decisions that worked once and then kept working long after they should have stopped.